Have you ever actually stopped and thought about why many Christians today call Mary the mother of God? And I know, some of you are already ready to go full Greta Thunberg on me. Like, how dare you even ask that type of question tonight? But I'm serious, right? Have you ever actually considered why we say that, or whether or not we should even say that to begin with? Because I'll be honest with you, right? I'll put all of my cards on the table. The first time I heard another Christian use that phrase, I'm not going to lie. I kind of paused for a second, not because I thought they were being heretical. Like, I clearly understood that there was, they weren't saying what they clearly was saying. And it definitely wasn't because I thought they were denying something true about Jesus. I didn't think any of those things, but rather it was because, if I'm being honest with you, that phrase is a little jarring. And I think it's jarring for a lot of people out there. It kind of catches you off guard if you're not ready for it, right? You hear it and you immediately feel like, okay, that person needs to explain what they're saying. Because the moment that you say Mary is the mother of God, you already know what's coming next. You already know that you have to follow it up with, okay, and so what we don't mean is that Mary created God, or what we don't mean is that she's the origin of the divine nature of Jesus, or what we don't mean is that she existed somehow before God. We're not saying any of those things tonight. All we're saying is that she gave birth to the person who is God in the flesh, who is God incarnate. That, of course, is Jesus. But I want you to notice what just happened there. If this phrase is supposed to bring theological clarity to a lot of people, but your first instinct after saying that is to clarify what it does not mean, then I think it really raises a very important question that a lot of us simply don't take the time to stop and ask ourselves. And that chiefly being, is this actually the clearest way to say what we're trying to say? And I know that sounds very simple, but it's true. And so that's why I want to explore in this video. Again, not to be controversial. This topic is already controversial, in and of itself. So I'm not trying to add to that controversy. And it's certainly not to dismiss centuries of church history either. I love church history. I think we can learn a lot from church history. And so I don't want to just dismiss anything just because it developed in church history. And it's certainly not to take cheap shots at traditions who choose to use this kind of language. Because again, this is not just language that you see in Catholicism. You see this in Orthodoxy. You see this in Protestantism. You kind of see this language in all of the streams of the Christian traditions. But rather, my goal is very simple. It is just to get us to pause and ask ourselves a very basic question, which is, are we communicating this truth in the clearest and most faithful way possible? That's it. Or are we saying more than Scripture itself ever says? Because, sometimes the issue isn't whether something is technically true, of course, after you qualify it. Rather, sometimes the issue is whether it's actually helpful to begin with. Now, I think before we can even engage in this question, honestly, I think we need to be fair here to everybody involved, because this phrase didn't just come out of nowhere. This isn't just people twiddling their thumbs and just being like, oh, how about we call Mary the mother of God? That's not how it went down. And so for those who may be new to this whole conversation, when people say that Mary is the mother of God, they are not trying to elevate Mary, at least inherently, they're not trying to elevate Mary into some kind of divine figure, right? That was never the original goal of this whole thing, right? Originally, this phrase was meant to protect something very specific and very true, and that was the identity of Jesus. You see, in the early church, especially around the time of the Council of Ephesus, there were some real and some tension-filled debates about how to understand exactly who Jesus is, and more specifically, how his divinity and how his humanity both relate to one another. And honestly, there's still some people who, still heavily wrestle with this, this situation today, because once you start thinking about it, it immediately raises, a lot of questions that you have to come to terms with. One of them being is Jesus one person, or is he two persons, or is he somehow, kind of divided? You'll hear this line of questioning be given to you if you are engaging with a Mormon or a Unitarian or whatever the case may be, right? For instance, I watched a debate between Jacob Hansen. I forgot who the other person was, and this is exactly the questions that he positioned, right? Or Dr. Dale Tuggy, another example. And so the concern at the Council of Ephesus was this: if you start separating Jesus too much, if you start to talk about him like there's a human person over there and there's a divine person over here, then you risk losing the unity of who Jesus actually is, of who the scriptures portray him to be. And so the phrase, the mother of God, or the Theotokos for short, was introduced to safeguard that truth. And the logic behind it was actually very simple. Mary didn't give birth to a separate human person who later became divine, who later became God. No, the person whom she gave birth to is the exact same person who is the eternal Son of God in the flesh, right? He is God incarnate. That's it. And so what's important to see here is that this title was never really about Mary, right? It was really about making sure we don't divide Jesus into two persons as we start to talk about his divinity and his humanity. And look, that's a completely valid concern, right? Every Christian should affirm, at least as far as I'm concerned, that Jesus is one person, he's fully God and fully man. And if you can't affirm that, then at that point you're stepping very outside of historic or Christian orthodoxy. And yes, I do mean you Mormons, and I do mean you Unitarians, and whoever, Jehovah Witness, whoever kind of fits within that mold. And so if that's what this phrase was trying to protect, then I think we can safely conclude that we're on the exact same page. And so now that we understand the intention, even if that intention was good, and it is, we still have to go back to the central question of this entire video, which is this actually the clearest way to communicate that truth? Because here's the thing. It's actually possible for something to be trying to protect a true idea and still not be the best way to communicate that idea. I know that sounds super simple, and it's probably because it is, but I've kind of noticed that in conversations like this, a lot of people struggle to say the super simple things out loud. Because the moment that you push back on a phrase like the mother of God, so many people, whether it's within Catholicism or in Orthodoxy or even in some camps of Protestantism, so many people will immediately assume the worst, and they'll assume that you're trying to reject the truth behind the title. Like you're somehow trying to divide Jesus up into his divine nature or into his human nature, or you're trying to weaken his identity, or you're trying to step outside the confines of orthodoxy. And I want to be very, very clear. That's not what is going on here, right? That's not my intention. That's not my goal, right? I'm not questioning who Jesus is. I'm not questioning the incarnation. I'm not questioning that Mary is the one who gave birth to the person who is fully God and fully man. I affirm all of that. So I just want to make sure all of my chips is on the table. Rather, what I am questioning is something much more simple and much more specific, right? I'm simply asking whether this particular phrase is the clearest and most faithful way to express that truth, right? That Mary is the mother of Jesus, who is God, right? Especially when we compare it to how Scripture seems to speak of this issue. Because at the end of the day, that has to be our standard. We can't just be content with just asking ourselves, can we make this phrase work if we add enough qualifications? That can't be the answer that we're just, stuck on. We have to ask the more deeper, more important question, which is this how Scripture chooses to say it? Right? Because when you look at how Scripture speaks of Mary, it actually keeps everything very, very simple. Right? It just calls her the mother of Jesus. And that's it. Right? That's the category that you constantly see throughout the Gospels. And Scripture doesn't feel the need to expand beyond that point. And at the same time, Scripture is very clear that Jesus is God. And so, of course, when you put those two truths together, it's very straightforward what you get. Mary is the mother of Jesus, who is God. Right? That's the framework that Scripture gives us. Now, I already know, right, that there are going to be some people who are deeply emotionally tied to this title, Theotokos. And I completely understand that, right? Because, again, you're going to see this appeal for very different reasons, right? Whether you're within Catholicism or Orthodoxy, and you're kind of like, no, we must hold to the different councils and things of that nature. Or if you're a Protestant and you just feel like, I kind of like the title, or I think maybe the council got it right, or whatever the case may be. Whatever the situation is, whatever your reason is for being deeply tied to this title, I completely understand. But I just want you to consider something. You see, there are really two ways theological language can function. Some terms can actually help to clarify what Scripture teaches, right? They organize truth and they kind of move the conversation forward, right? That's actually what you want your theological terms, your theological language to do, by the way. But then you have this other category where you have other terms that really don't do that. Instead, they stall the conversation because now you have to explain what you don't mean well before you explain what you do mean. And, that's only if you're able to get to the point where you're able to explain what you do mean, because most people are still going to be stuck of what you actually said. And a good example of the first category is actually the Trinity. And I bring that up because I already know that some people are going to try to appeal to this to justify using the Theotokos. But if you actually look closely at what the Trinity is doing, all the Trinity does is summarizes what Scripture already teaches about God. Right? It tells us that the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Spirit is God, while also maintaining that there is only one God. And so, as you can see, it really doesn't remove anything. It preserves the categories that Scripture itself gives us, and it just brings us clarity, right? And so that's why I call a good example of how a theological term, theological language can help us to move the conversation forward. But you see, the Theotokos doesn't function like that. It functions very differently. It takes what Scripture teaches, yes, that Mary is the mother of Jesus and that, of course, Jesus is God. But then it compresses it into just saying Mary is the mother of God. And so in doing so, it removes the very structure that kind of keeps those two categories clear. And so when someone hears Mary is the mother of God without any clarification, like if you didn't add your different qualifications, it naturally sounds like Mary is the source or origin of God himself. And of course, that's not what we mean when we say this. But that's exactly the issue, is that that's not what we're saying. But looking at the grammar, that is what we're saying. Because now at this point, we're not explaining anymore, we're correcting. And instead of moving the conversation forward, we're really, stepping back to fix all of these misunderstandings. And that completely defeats the purpose of using this title in the first place. And you can actually see this play out in real time, right? If you go up to an unbeliever, or maybe to a new Christian, or even a seasoned Christian like myself, who was just unfamiliar with this language, and you go tell them that Mary is the mother of God, I guarantee you, I can bet your bottom dollar that they're not going to land on the intended meaning behind what you're saying. More likely, they're probably going to misunderstand it because, again, that's the most natural reading of this phrase. And we even have an historical example like this. You see, in the Quran, you see Muhammad correcting what appears to be the belief that God has a mother, right? And again, we all know that that's not what Christians mean whenever they invoke the Theotokos. But that just goes to show you how easily this language can be misunderstood. And so when people ask, or when people are obsessed with just asking themselves, well, Jedi, is this technically true? My response is very simple. Maybe, if of course you go on to qualify what you mean, but that's not the most important question I think we should be asking ourselves. You see, I think the better question is whether it's actually clear, right? Does it move the conversation forward, or does it bring us back to clarification mode? Because that distinction makes all of the difference. And you know what's really ironic? You know what's really ironic about all of this, of this whole discussion about the Theotokos, is that as we move through it, we can actually forget that the original point of the Theotokos in the first place was to tell us more about who Jesus is, right? It was never meant to just be one of the many titles that we give to Mary, right? It was always meant to clarify who Jesus was, how has Jesus' divine nature related to his human nature. That's it. And so if this phrase isn't actually helping us to do that, then I think it's fair to take a step back and ask ourselves whether there's a clearer way to say this. Because at the end of the day, elevating Mary's title doesn't really help us to make sense of how Jesus is both God and man. If anything, all it does is help. It can start to shift the focus away from him and onto her. And I think that's very important for us to recognize and just call out the obvious, because historically speaking, that is how this language has functioned, right? It is kind of taken a life of its own, right? Over time, it hasn't just stayed about Christ. It's often, if anything, it's often shaped how many people started to think about Mary, especially in ways that kind of goes beyond how Scripture speaks of her. For example, over time, we start, to see some interesting language develop around Mary that, again, goes beyond how Scripture speaks, right? You begin to hear things like her being called a mediatrix, or distinctions like hyperdulia, which, is an idea that kind of sets her apart from the saints, and it puts her in this unique category of veneration. And again, to be fair, many Catholics and Orthodox will immediately qualify what they mean by that, right? So as to not insinuate that they're worshiping Mary like they would worship God or even Jesus. But do you see the pattern? Is this not the same thing that we just finished walking through, right? Do you see how once you move beyond Scripture's categories, once you move beyond Scripture's language, even if you have the good intentions, it can easily begin to shape how people think in ways that go further than Scripture itself ever established. Now, to be clear, I do believe the bishops at the Council of Ephesus were trying to do something that was good and that was necessary, right? They were trying to defend the identity of Christ. And again, that's something that we should absolutely affirm. We should call them noble for. We should give them all of their flowers whenever we see them. But I don't think the best way to honor that is to start doubling down on language that hasn't consistently brought the clarity that they were aiming for, right? I think the better way to honor their work is simply to continue the mission, to continue asking whether or not there's a clear way to communicate the exact same truth, right? And this is where I think we kind of reached a fork in the road for a lot of people, right? Because we have to ask ourselves, do we honestly care about being clear? Or do we just care about being historical or even just technically right? Right? Are we going to use language that communicates what Scripture teaches in a way that believers, new believers, and even unbelievers can understand? Or are we just going to keep defaulting to what feels familiar, even if it requires us to constantly explain what we do not mean in order to be understood? And look, I get it. Right, this is one of those topics that people don't like to touch, and clearly, as you can see, for good reason. But if we actually care about avoiding unnecessary confusion, which I hope all of us do, then I think it's a question that we have to consider. You see, personally, I'm comfortable with saying that Mary is the mother of Jesus, who is God. I think it's clean, it's clear, and I think it's unmistakably biblical. And yes, I know it may take a few extra steps. It may take a few extra words to say. But if a few extra words help avoid misunderstanding, then I think that's worth it. I don't know about you, but I think it's worth it for me. And honestly, I think the Apostle Paul gives us a helpful framework here. You see, in 1 Corinthians, he actually reminds us of something that, a lot of us today simply have to remind ourselves of. And really what it was is that the Corinthians were using this phrase where they used to say, all things are lawful for me. right? And Paul affirms them. He says, all things may be lawful for you. Like, of course, using the Theotokos to refer to Mary. But not all things are helpful. And certainly not all things build others up. You see, my friends, even if someone says, well, technically, Janai, we can use this phrase, given that we clarify what we actually mean by it, the deeper question that I think Paul would want us to ask ourselves is it helpful? And does it actually build understanding? Or does it just create confusion that we then have to correct? Because if we're being honest, this phrase hasn't always moved the conversation forward, right? In many cases, it's actually created more discussion about Mary than it has even about Jesus. And it's confused both unbelievers and new believers alike, which again completely goes against the purpose of what the bishops of Ephesus at the Council of Ephesus were trying to do. Like, if you would have told them, hey, this is going to lead to X, Y, and Z, I think they would have came back and said, all right, well, let's kind of get more precise here, if I'm being charitable to them. And so if that's the case, then I think we at least owe it to ourselves and to the generations coming after us to at least reconsider how we're communicating this truth. Again, not to change the truth, but just to communicate it more clearly. I think, personally, that it's good enough just to say that Mary is the mother of Jesus, who is God. Again, I know that's probably not as sexy as saying the Theotokos. I love saying the Theotokos. It kind of just rolls off the tongue. But if it means helping to clarify and to ward off misunderstanding, my friends, I think it's worth it. But anyways, guys, look, I love to hear your thoughts, right? I'm open to having a discussion in the comment section. How do you see this, right? How do you wrestle with this? Because I know I'm not the only one who's wrestled with this question. And look, as always, if you found this video to be helpful, go ahead, like, share, subscribe. Really does help the channel a lot. But until next time, guys, peace.